you're rather serious because I need an excuse to try to get this up, and I've thought of one. I'm going to ask you to do, I'll do it in a minute. I'm going to ask you to do something I get my first year students to do. So if they can do it, you can do it. And there is a reason for doing it. How many of you live in Oxfordshire? Lots of you, great, okay. Oxford and Oxfordshire, these are migrant areas, that's where we are. So what I'm going to ask you to do, listen to it carefully, imagine you're 18 and so on, is I'm going to want you to move seats. You're going to move seats in a very particular way. What you're going to do is we're going to form a map of where you were born or where you come from. So if you were born in Oxford, you're going to be sitting exactly where you are there. That is Oxford. Okay? If you were born further south, my friend born in Guernsey is going to be down here. If you were born slightly to the west, Bob may be from Swindon, I'm not quite sure, but you're just over there. London, you're over here. Scotland, you're at the back. My friend from America is over there on the edge. So what you're doing is arranging yourselves so that you're going to form a map of the world that all fit in based on where you're born. Now, one good thing about this is you're going to meet somebody else in this room who's bothered enough to get up at 10 o'clock on a Saturday morning, lives in Oxfordshire, and comes from you. But there is a reason why I need you to do this, because I'm going to tell you about the migrant city. Yeah. So Oxford in the middle. You can come and sit down with your geography. Are you all with us? Yeah. Excellent. And the circle round, it kind of fits slightly older as well from when they came. Can you move forward? Can you move forward, please? China. China's there. Come right down here. Teresa. Okay. Give you about one more minute and you just have to sit. Oxford is a migrant city. Oxford has always been a migrant city. 28% of the people of Oxford at the moment were born overseas. Can you stick your hand up if you're born overseas? Oh, you've done well. Nobody in the middle. Okay, you're the born overseas, so that looks not far off 28% of the audience. You are quite representative of Oxford. Oxford's going to be a younger city. Who was born in London? There we are, got London in the right place. Who was born in Wales? Got some Welsh Scots. The north of England. Great. And let's go for, so who's from Oxfordshire? There we go. 4. Brilliant. This makes my point. 4. And again, we are representative. You can often come to a meeting like this and just think, I often think this, it's the old people a little bit like me and most of the population are normal and they're not that bothered and we're weird. You are representative. This city is a migrant city. I'll do a very, very short story of my family in this city, and then I'll talk about solutions and what can become. My granddad came here as a migrant in the 1930s. He was able to rent on the Abingdon Road an amount of space that he'd never seen up in Burfield in the house that his family rented when he was a child. Back then, people were practicing private renting, landlords took everything. My mum and dad came to the city. They were able to buy. They were able to buy for £400 in Cowley. They rented in Jericho because it was the very cheapest place. They struggled. Yeah, Jericho was a red light district. I'd love to tell you a story of Oxford, but I won't because I'm only going to talk about 10 minutes. They struggled to get a mortgage in the 1970s, but just managed to get it in Rotherham House okay. But they have a memory. Everybody who's come to Oxford over a long period of time has a memory that from the 70s onwards it became much harder. People came in off the countryside. They came in from Oxfordshire. If you've ever read Lark Rise the Candlewood, that was written about Juniper Hill just north of here. The Oxfordshire villages had no electricity until the 1960s. So this city was surrounded by absolute poverty. Little villages near Bicester didn't have gas, didn't have electricity. They now cost a fortune because the M40 takes you to London. But that transformation has just happened in about 40 or 50 years. People walked in from the Welsh valleys in the 1930s because there were no jobs in the Welsh valleys in the 1930s. The Valleys had been the highest immigrant centre in the world just 100 years ago, apart from California. But people came here, they came to work in the car factory. They came from Great Yarmouth because the shipping, the fisheries were doing badly. So I grew up in the 1960s and 70s with immigrants and the children of immigrants. That's what the city was. But they were largely housed fairly well. They were housed fairly well because when people did come in the 1930s, some were allowed to build houses. There was a lot of self-building. Private builders built houses here. They also built the Custom Wall, sort of the people from social housing, which was also built here, getting across. And the city accommodated the immigrants that came in. Since the 1970s through to the 1980s, 1990s, in this particular place, there has been hardly any building. Very, very little. It's constrained absolutely by the green belt. But the number of people coming in has not slowed down at all. The population of Oxford, it's very hard to enumerate it because it's so high and so variable, but it is incredibly squeezed. Last year, the average house price was about 9.5 times the average earnings, which people complained about as ridiculous. This January, it had got up to about 11.5 times average incomes, and it's still rising just as fast at the moment. People who got here in the 70s or 80s and stayed think it's just like it was for them when they're young, and they simply don't realise the difference. It is much, much worse. The result is that everybody takes a step down. So university professors like me, who might have once bought a grand house somewhere in North Oxford, are able to buy a house. But it's largely just us, and it isn't in North Oxford, but we can buy a house. University lecturers are having trouble renting. If a university lecturer has a child or a baby and they make the mistake of telling the landlords that they have a baby, the landlords increasingly won't want to house them. And you can go down and down the hierarchy, the class hierarchy of this city, and you see everybody taking a step down. At the bottom, this means 40,000 people commuting into the city every day. It means people a mile along this road, sharing a field water room illegally in the worst housing that is rented out on the very dodgy private market. My reason for saying this and getting you to rearrange yourselves and realise that you all are migrants is there's a remarkable lack of solidarity in this city because it is such a migrant turnover place. I mean, this is a European success story. This is a cosmopolitan city. It's a 28% overseas born city where UKIP don't even say anything. You know, UKIP's objection is this kind of a place. And that is all good, and that all works. But the problem is there is so little long-term memory and such a division by when you manage to get into housing, if you did here, or when you manage to get your social tenancy so that you're there and you're safe at least for the time being in that one. And then the mass private renters of Oxford simply move through, and they tend to be young. They tend to be your age because people tend not to survive. They tend not to last more than 5 or 10 years because they simply can't bring in the income to allow them to pay the rent. I'm not over-exaggerating here. If you go to the city schools and talk to the teachers and you're my age, the first thing you notice is they're all very young, or almost all very young. In fact, the head teacher's my age. And the reason they're all very young is they get sick of spending almost all their salary renting in Oxford. So Oxford has this incredible turnover of teachers in its schools. In some of the schools that do worse, they can lose, at the very worst extreme, half the teachers in the summer go to work somewhere where at least they can afford a holiday rather than simply paying the rent. The city is becoming increasingly dysfunctional. It is hard to attract people to work here. It is hard to keep them once they do work here, and you've got people living in a quality of housing that is actually declining. The overcrowding is rising, but also, of course, these landlords are bothered about the quality of housing. One great shock to me, and I should have known this because I looked at housing for years, was coming down from Sheffield from the north of England and trying to rent and trying to buy a house. And suddenly realising that nobody bothered to do their house up at all. There was no need to make it look nice. You could sell it. The selling price in Oxford is simply based on the square footage. That's it. That's what the prices are based on. And renting, there's no need to do anything to rent a house. If you're a landlord, you can pick and choose the tenants you want. There's no need to repair housing, so the housing stock is getting worse and worse in terms of quality every year, because more and more is owned by landlords. If you try and buy a house, you'll find you're competing with landlords, because they can make more money at the moment out of you. My reason for trying to go on and on about this is it's now a crisis that affects an incredibly wide section of society. It's at least 95-96% of the population. There we go. Find housing difficult. Thank you. A few people who've been here for a long time, and the people who run the city, the older ones, not the younger ones who run the city, the older ones are complacent about it. Or may even be sitting there going, look at where I'm going to retire when I sell. People who are at the top of the university can be a little bit complacent about it. Only those at the top, you have to be at the top of the university to have enough salary to actually be slightly complacent about housing in the city. People running the hospitals can be complacent about it. Everybody working in hospitals can't be complacent about it. We have never had it as hard as it is now to be housed in this city. And it has to be possible to galvanise the fact that this is a problem for the majority of the population and to rise up the agenda if people are simply willing to talk about it. Just 5 minutes on what you could do, what kind of things could be done. Almost anything you do will help. You don't have to come out with a whole raft of proposals and say, if you do my 27-point plan, we'll be okay. Almost any interventions that are positive could have a much bigger effect than simply that intervention. One is improving rent regulation. Economists hate it when you call it rent controls, but improving rent regulation. We currently have rent regulation. You have to wait 2 months before you can evict somebody. That's a regulation. Change that regulation to make it 3 years, or to head towards the German system where you have to buy your tenants out if you want them to leave earlier. And private tenants will have more security, but investors and private landlords won't want to buy property as fast as they are doing because they won't be able to make as much money from it. In Scotland, they brought in regulations so that letting agencies can't charge a whole series of fees. We could do that in England. You can bring in capital gains tax on the gains made in property. Osborne's done it in a tiny way from 2015. If Osborne can do something like that, it shows it's possible. You could do a lot more. I would go for 100% inheritance tax. But you don't need 100% inheritance tax to begin to make things better. What you need are enough interventions so that house prices stop rising. And if house prices stop rising, people's behaviour changes. People don't hold on to that home in their old age so they can give it to their family, because the longer you hold on to the home, the less it's worth. The incentives to downsize if you're in the private sector are massive if you have house prices going down. My grandfather, who came here in the 1930s, bought a house in Leeds in the 1950s, and the price went down. Because back then, prices were not going up much, not down much, they could go down. Housing was for a home. Nobody thought that you were going to make money simply out of buying a house. We could bring in decent council taxes. That is, bounds above the current top bound in Oxford. That would raise an enormous sum of money for Oxford City Council from people who can well afford to pay that money. I can talk, if you want, about how they can afford to pay the money even if their income is very low. We can have a register of landlords. Newham has a register of landlords. We can build a little bit more social housing than we're currently doing. I think, I've forgotten how many houses there are on West Barton, but it's a tiny number that's being built. by the City Council. They're trying very hard, but they're constrained by the borders of the city.
10% less than they're supposed to be building on the planning board.
Okay, 10% less than they're supposed to be building. And it's tiny, it's tiny. We can look towards the rest of Europe, where 30% of houses are in effect self-built, not involving these big builders, and you can encourage that. For most of the country, these kind of things will have a massive beneficial effect. There are two parts of the country where they won't. One is London, because London is ever attracted to more and more people, and the other are places like Oxford. There aren't many places like Oxford. And here we actually do need more homes. Here there is no way to satisfy the desire to live in Oxford without having more homes. And if you're trying to work out how you get more homes, you can get a few more into the city. You can get a few more people living in the most underpopulated area of Oxford. Where are the most empty houses in Oxford? Shut up. North Oxford has the highest number of empty homes at any one time. But even doing that will not give you very much. Oxford needs to expand east and west off the floodplain within 3 miles of car tracks so you can cycle to the middle. And at some point this will almost certainly happen because of the growth in the city that there is economically at the moment. Constraining one of your few places outside London, which is economically booming, just seems a bit silly. Current rates of immigration, we are going to overtake Germany as the largest country of Europe in about 20 years' time. We've got a choice. Either we try to stop that, try to stop people coming, or we're going to accept that that is what's occurring, and it's good news if people want to come to the place you're in. But this is going to affect Oxford. Lastly, what Oxford needs also is for London to be solved. London is not solved. If the housing crisis in London, which is the most extreme housing crisis we have in the country, average property price is now £500,000. If that isn't solved, and we're going to be solved quickly, Oxford's going to have a huge problem, because Oxford becomes, even though it's massively expensive, Oxford becomes cheaper than Barking and Dagenham. Now, if your choice is between living in Barking and Dagenham and doing your job in London, or living in Oxford and paying £7 for the bus and doing your job in London, what are you going to do? We're building a new train station at Water Eaton. That train station will be open in the spring. That station takes you to Marylebone in 1 hour. Marylebone in London is the north end of Harley Street. Where are the people who work in Harley Street going to want to live when they're commuting by train in 1 hour? You can see what's already happening to the city. You can see what's about to happen to the city. It's a crisis for the people who've managed, the winners, the people who've managed to hang on in here. It's a crisis for all the employers of the city, who are finding that it's harder and harder to actually get people to do the jobs that they've got the money for. And when they lose somebody who managed to buy a house 35 years ago, they're having to hire somebody who lives in Birmingham to come in to do it. You have, as far as I can see, a kind of coalition of interest that is incredibly strong. The reason why Oxford didn't expand for a long period was antagonism between the city and the university, between the car plant and the university. That antagonism has largely dissipated. So the scope for this particular city to actually expand and be a slightly more normal size for a city in this part of the country between Birmingham and London is very, very great. But there's a lot of reluctance about this. And lastly, the last set of people who may have an interest in this are the Conservative councillors of Oxfordshire. You know, the county has always been run by the Conservatives. One problem for the Conservative councillors of Oxfordshire is that their roads are now full. The A40 fills up, the A34 fills up. Quality of life in the county is decreasing as more and more people are living in small market towns in the county and trying to get to Oxford. At some point, even the Conservative county councillors of Oxfordshire are going to begin to realise that building homes on the edge of Oxford will improve the quality of life of their constituents. And it won't do. This is very unradical compared to what Dorling was worried about. but it won't turn the county red, which has been their reason for not allowing building, and particularly not allowing social rented building or innovative building or community building, because if you build those kinds of housing, you get Labour voters. That has gone, but one reason we say so little action here is that prejudice is still behind. But ultimately, we need housing values to fall, and fall steadily year on year on year. Rents will then fall, we need rent controls as well, and we do need to correct supply a little bit. If this sounds like pie in the sky, just give you one last quote. The quote is from Grant Shapps. Grant Shapps, when he was housing minister a couple of years ago, he's now the chairman of the Conservative Party. When Grant Shapps was housing minister, he said house prices need to rise 2% below wages. That anything else was just stupid. Wages have been falling. Now, somebody's told Grant to stop saying that thing. But when even Grant Shapps, who wasn't very good at producing a dodgy company, and we can go on and on about him, even Grant Shapps can see that our incredibly expensive housing has to stop being expensive. I think there is some hope. The ultimate hope comes from the fact that nobody's going to be able to buy these houses at the prices they're going at. It's going to come to an end at some point. The question is, can you come to an end in a better way than otherwise? And lastly, very lastly of all, please do get a chance to say hello to the people left or right and behind you, because you are the people who got to get up at 10 o'clock in the morning in Oxford, and I think it's just worth meeting some other people who've got something in common with you geographically as well, because it is quite hard work keeping going and doing this kind of thing. Thank you very much.